1931. And going along with today's theme, I am also a federal prosecutor. Justice Jackson's, Attorney General Jackson's speech was read at my first swearing in 2007 in Washington, D.C. I was an assistant United States attorney there for 13 years. And I served in the Inspector General's office at the National Science Foundation with Trini for several years, and now I am the first assistant United States attorney under U.S. Attorney Ross here in the Western District of New York. The office got some good news this past week. Trini was named to the Attorney General's Advisory Committee, which is actually quite a high honor. She is one, there are 93 U.S. attorneys in the country, and she is one of only 12 who will be represented on that committee with the Attorney General of the United States. And so her voice and the voice of Western New York will get a clear hearing in Washington. But I'm standing here right now because of a family connection that I have that's also related to today's theme, and that's that my grandfather, Joe Leeson, was a federal agent during Prohibition, and he was one of Eliot Ness's untouchables in Chicago. His picture is up there, the one on the right. I am, in the picture on the left, standing outside of the Transportation Building in Chicago, which is the office building where Eliot Ness and the Untouchables worked during the Capone investigation. And I want to thank Greg Peterson for inviting us all here today. I also want to thank Federal Magistrate Judge Jeremiah McCarthy, who's going to oversee the proceedings today, and Alan Bozer, who is going to be joining us as Al Capone shortly. You're talking about technology and things. When I first started, the beginning of my legal career was actually as a messenger working in the mailroom at Phillips Lytle in Buffalo, and I used to deliver inter-office mail to Alan at his firm across town in an inter-office envelope before email and all of that. During this trial today, we're doing a reenactment of the trial of Al Capone. This is not a full reenactment, it is more of a staged reading. I will be playing the role of Chicago U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson. And also following along the theme of technology, one of the things that Eliot Ness and the Untouchables accomplished was that they brought criminal investigations and prosecutions into the 20th century. And wiretapping was brand new back then. You're going to hear, even though Eliot Ness didn't testify at the real Capone trial, he was there. And you're going to hear from Eliot Ness today talking about what wiretapping was like in 1931. The law was also not so advanced. There was no such thing as organized crime before Al Capone. And it was prosecutors like George Johnson and agents like Eliot Ness and my grandfather who created the investigative techniques and the legal techniques that were invented and utilized to fight organized crime that we still use today. Both Judge McCarthy and I are graduates of Notre Dame Law School, and at least I'm not sure if he had G. Robert Blakey as a professor, but G. Robert Blakey was one of my professors, actually wrote the RICO statute, which we use today to combat organized crime offenses. So I'm just going to give us a little bit of context before we get started with the trial. We're going to go back in time to Chicago in 1931. And of course, the subject of our event today is Al Capone. Right before he went on trial for real in October of 1931, he actually gave this article to a reporter where he gave his advice on how he would run the country if he were in charge. Of course, he went up against Eliot Ness, the famous federal agent who picked his 9 untouchables because they were incorruptible, and could not be bought or bribed in their investigations. This is actually a family photo. My grandfather is third from the right. These are some federal agents who were about to go out on a raid of a distillery. You can see some of them have the axes in their hands. And two of these guys, including my grandfather, were among the agents recruited by Eliot Ness to be untouchables. Once my grandfather joined the Untouchables, his partner, Sam Seeger, was a Buffalo native. He's actually buried in St. Matthew's Cemetery in West Seneca. But they began to listen in on the gangsters and their phone calls using wiretaps. They also staked them out in an empty apartment and followed them in vehicles to discover the first major brewery that Eliot Ness would raid. And there's some newspaper coverage from my grandfather's scrapbook of a couple of those raids. So eventually, in June of 1931, two indictments came down against Capone. One was by the revenue agents who had been investigating his taxes. He was indicted for tax crime. That's what he eventually went on trial for. And Eliot Ness and the Untouchables indicted him for 5,000 counts of conspiracy to violate the prohibition laws. He never actually went to trial on those crimes because he was convicted, not to give anything away, in the tax trial. We'll erase that from everybody's memory. So as I said, this is a staged reading. We did put on the full trial at the Eliot Ness Festival in Coudersport, Pennsylvania in 2019, and we're going to do it again this year in 2021, so everybody is welcome if you want to come. I'll put the dates up at the end. But this was in the courtroom in Coudersport that we first put on this trial that I have pared down so that we can do this in the time allotted today. And so I'm going to bring us back to October of 1931. This is the federal courthouse in Chicago. It's no longer there, but that's what it looked like. And as you can see on the right, Al Capone has just gotten out of his car and is walking into court.
After many years of investigating America's first public enemy, number one, federal prosecutors were finally ready to bring Al Capone to justice. He was known across the country as Scarface, or the Big Fellow, but the nickname he much preferred was Snorky. Capone was the kingpin of the most profitable crime syndicate in Chicago's history. He ruled with an iron fist. Cops on the beat, lawmakers in City Hall, and even judges on the bench were on his payroll. And woe be to any rival who sought to invade his turf. Many had paid with their lives. Yet, Capone was seen as a folk hero by many. While he lived in the lap of luxury, he opened a soup kitchen for the poor. He boasted that he proudly gave the thirsty public what the public wanted: good quality booze at reasonable prices. Putting together the evidence and seating a jury that was honest and courageous enough to convict him would not be easy. In fact, the jurors who are about to be seated here have no intention of delivering a fair verdict. That's right. The fix is in. Somebody on the inside sneaked their names to the Capone outfit. So the 12 men waiting behind that door have been showered with everything from $100 bills to prize fight tickets to threats to their well-being. And oddly, the judge knows all about it and has done nothing. So the defense team has every reason in the world to feel very confident about this trial's outcome. Judge Wilkerson has sent word that he is prepared to proceed.
I am U.S. Attorney George E.Q. Johnson, and I am leading the prosecution in this case.
My name is Albert Fink, and I'm here on behalf of the defense and my distinguished client, Al Capone.
All rise.
Hear ye, hear ye, this court is now in session with the Honorable James H. Wilkerson presiding. God save the United States and this honorable court.
Please be seated. Bailiff, you may now escort the defendant to his seat. I see he's already there.
Hey, Al, it looks like you dressed for the occasion.
Yeah, well, it's kind of loud in here, but I got to do something to give the crowd a thrill. And by the way, buddy, if you think I'm going to walk out of here in shackles, you got another thing coming.
Well, we'll see about that. I'm Frank Wilson. I led the investigation, the Revenue Department's investigation into Capone's taxes. Al, I have to tell you, you have a lot of charisma and talent. It's just a shame that you couldn't have channeled it in a different location. You could have been a real asset to society.
Hey, buddy, I've done all right for myself and for a lot of my friends, if I tell you. By the way, counselor, which one of these stuffed shirts is Elliot Ness?
That's him right there, Al. I'm surprised he didn't bring his press with him.
He may look cool, calm, and collected right now, but he won't be so smug once he's behind bars.
Are we ready to proceed?
Your Honor, before we seat the jurors, Attorney Fink and I have a preliminary matter to take up with the court. In fact, you may not even need to seat this jury.
What's this? I'm not fond of surprises.
Judge, Your Honor, the defense has reached an agreement with the government, and my client wishes to enter a plea of guilty.
What? Why was I not made aware of this? Mr. Johnson, is this true?
Yes, Your Honor, the defendant has agreed to admit to tax evasion and prohibition violations, and in return, the government will recommend a sentence of 2.5 years.
Whoa, gentlemen, if I agree to that sentence, Mr. Capone could be up for parole in what, 8 months? Are you really willing to agree to that?
That's you.
That's me. Oh, yeah, that's right. I reached an easy way out with the feds. That's what I said.
Mr. Johnson, I think it's an insult to this court that anyone would expect me to go along with something that's so lenient.
Your Honor, I cannot go back on my word to the defense. We're really banking on the judge approving this plea deal. What most people don't know is that this case is all about legalities. All we have is some rather flimsy evidence that is circumstantial. We're really skating on thin ice.
Gentlemen, I'm not going to let a gangster come in here and run my courtroom. I'm quite certain that this deal would stink in the nostrils of the American people. I'll agree to allow Mr. Capone to plead guilty, but I and no one else will decide the sentence. So, gentlemen, what will it be?
It's ridiculous. If you think about what's going on, it's ridiculous. Your Honor, given the uncertainty in the sentencing, my client pleads not guilty.
All right, then, we'll proceed with the trial. Is the government ready?
Yes, Your Honor, the people are ready.
And the defense?
Yes, Your Honor.
Very well. So before we allow the jury to enter, it's peculiar to me that a man who has earned the dubious distinction of public enemy number 1 now stands before this court for supposedly skimping on his taxes.
Your Honor, if I may, it is our intention to send the message across the land loudly and clearly that no one is above the law.
Your Honor, our client has been repeatedly subjected to an endless stream of innuendo, highly inflammatory publicity that contains not even a kernel of truth. Why, half of the city has been turned against my poor client. By this concerted effort by the government to destroy his good name. So now we have these groundless tax evasion charges, and yes, we intend to knock down that myth today, Your Honor.
Well, gentlemen, let's get one thing straight. The grandstanding is going to stop right now. Is there anything else before we seat the jury?
Just one more thing, Your Honor. In view of the court's rejection of the plea arrangements, we would like to introduce into evidence a certified copy of the letter that the defendant signed in an effort to settle this case. We will introduce it as Exhibit Number 1. Specifically, Mr. Capone was acknowledging some $70,000 of income tax from various so-called enterprises and a tax liability of $15,000 for the years 1927 and 1928.
Your Honor, we have no objections to them enter that into evidence. The truth of the matter is that agreement shows a sincere effort by my client to pay his taxes. That's what this trial is all about. He wants to pay his taxes.
In response, Your Honor, we believe the document proves that this defendant was actually trying to pay only a small fraction of what he owed. We believe it's the proverbial smoking gun that supports our case.
$15,000 might sound like chicken feed to you. But remember, this is 1931. So Capone was really agreeing to pay a tax bill of almost $280,000 when you translate that to 2022 terms.
Well, since there are no objections, I'm going to admit it. Now, is there anything else?
Yes, Your Honor. May we approach?
Ladies and gentlemen, it has been brought to my attention that there is a gentleman positioned at the end of the second row up there whose behavior has been rather concerning to some people in this courtroom. Bailiff, I want you to approach Mr. Philip DeAndrea, seated on the end of the second row, and see what you might find under that trench coat.
Mr. DeAndrea, please rise. Please open up your coat and turn yourself to the jury. Take a look. Yeah.
Oh, good grief. Get that guy out of here. I'm not sure if this is a trial or a circus. I'm not sure if this is a trial or a circus, but I'm bound and determined to stop all the sideshows. So at this time, we will introduce the jury. However, I have a little surprise. Bailiff, I would like you to take those jurors sequestered in that room down to the back steps to the courtroom of Judge Edwards on the first floor. Then you are to immediately return here with the jury from his case. Then we will proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Mysteriously following.
I object.
So there you have it. Like I told you before, the fix was in. But the venerable Judge Wilkerson knew all along that the jury was crooked. So he reached into his bag of tricks. He got together with another judge, and they worked out a deal to simply swap their juries. Speaking of which, it appears that our new jury has arrived.
We will now begin with opening statements. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you. Thank you, Your Honor. There are a lot of matters that are not before us today, and you must base your verdict on one very central issue, which is whether the defendant did or did not pay his taxes. Now, you may hear testimony that speaks to the point of whether Mr. Capone is the kind of man who is inclined to obey the law. My father always said that a furry creature that walks like a skunk, looks like a skunk, and smells like a skunk is more than likely not your family's pet cat. Some very dedicated, and I will add courageous people will appear before you today. You're going to meet some interesting characters, that's for sure. And we are confident that you will determine, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that this defendant is guilty.
Does the defense have an opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor, if I may. Members of the jury, today you're going to hear all kinds of wild tales about my client, including this carefully crafted myth that he didn't want to pay his taxes. He did try to pay his taxes. That was Exhibit 1 from the prosecution. You'll see an exhibit, a certified letter to prove it. And the greedy federal government just kept demanding more. Lord knows how many of your hard-earned tax dollars have been wasted by that government in trying to pin something on my client, basically because they don't like my client. So they've made this venture to prosecute him. They may even be a bit jealous of him. What you haven't heard is the other side of the story. How the sudden surge of a thoroughbred race horse has forced my client to dig down deep to cover his losses. How the poor souls of the south side of this town have found a nutritious meal and a warm place to stay, all because of the generosity of Al Capone. Most importantly, you'll also hear how Mr. Capone made every effort to pay much more than anyone would consider his fair share of taxes. So none of us would have to go through this ordeal today, including you as the jury. So we look forward to setting the record straight, and we surely are ready to proceed. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, you may call your first witness.
The people call Mr. Chester Bragg.
Good job. Good job. I like it.
Have a seat. Raise your right hand and put this on the Bible. Robert Jackson, country lawyer, do you promise to swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Bragg, is it correct that you were deputized to carry out a raid at a business known as the Hawthorne Hotel in suburban Chicago, wherein a substantial gambling operation was located?
Yes, I was.
Could you explain to us what you observed during that raid?
Sure. I was assigned to guard the front door while all of the other guys were busy dismantling the machines and carting them out of there. They had slot machines, roulette wheels, you name it. There were a lot of people clamoring to get away and a pretty good-sized crowd out in the street trying to get a look.
Did you have occasion to see the defendant that evening?
I sure did. This black car pulls up and he bounds out of the back seat and pushes his way through the crowd. Of course, most people saw who he was and got out of the way. And he comes up and gets in my face. Then I says to him, "What the hell? Do you think this is a party? I mean, I ain't scared of nobody."
And did Mr. Capone say anything in response?
Yeah, he got this mean look in his face and he said, "Hey, pal, I'm the owner of this joint."
Thank you. No further questions.
Mr. Fink, would you like to cross-examine the witness?
So thank you, Your Honor.
You may step down, sir.
The people call Mr. Leslie Shumway.
Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Good morning. Could you please describe your position at the Hawthorne Hotel?
Well, basically, I kept the books, and I took care of the cash, every penny of it. I made sure nobody got their crooked meat hooks on it.
I see. And who was the owner of the Hawthorne?
I'm not sure I exactly know that. Come to think of it, different people were in charge, but I can't tell you for sure who actually owned it.
Let me put it another way. Did you have any reason to believe that the defendant, Mr. Capone, was connected with the Hawthorne?
Yes, I did take orders for Mr. Capone. Well, sort of.
I object. Sort of? What's that supposed to mean? That's way too broad, Your Honor. Totally unfair to my client.
Sustained.
I'm
you.
sorry. Did you at any time have any conversation with this defendant about the handling of the money at the Hawthorne?
Yes. One time, Al asked me what I would do if I got stuck up, and I told him, I I would just let him take it. And he said, "That's right." He says, "We have ways of dealing with people like that, so you don't have to. Les, all you got to do, get a good look at the guy's face, and we'll handle it from there."
Do you have any estimate of how much money was taken in at the Hawthorne?
I don't know. We probably netted $1,000 a day.
By $1,000, you mean a profit of about $1,000 per day, or somewhere around $300,000 in a year.
I guess, like I said, I'm just estimating.
No further questions.
Mr. Fink?
Based on the fact that this trial is all about paying taxes, I mean, nobody's on trial for gambling here, Your Honor. And with no documentation as to my client's ownership of the Hawthorne, I guess I have nothing, Your Honor.
Mr. Shumway, you may step down. Mr. Johnson?
The people call Mr. Fred Reese.
Please, raise your right hand. You promise to swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Reese, is it true that you were employed as a cashier at a gambling house in suburban Chicago known as The Ship in 1927 and 1928, and that one of your jobs was to assist with the handling of the business's profits?
Yes, that's one of the things I did.
Please explain that process to the court.
Well, let's see. It was my job to collect all the loot that was coming in. You know, the profits. And make sure it ended up where it was supposed to go.
And what did that entail?
I was in charge of getting the cash over to the bank and turning it in for cashier's checks. Then I would deposit them to credit of the Laramie Kennel Club at the First National Bank.
To the best of your recollection, what was the Laramie Kennel Club?
It was a dog track. You know, racing dogs, greyhounds.
And who owned it?
As far as I know, there was 3 of them. Mr. Patton, Mr. O'Hare, and Mr. Capone.
I assume you're referring to the defendant, Mr. Alphonse Capone?
Yes, he was one of them.
Did you keep records of the profits at the Ship?
I didn't save any paperwork, but the place probably netted about $4,000 a week. Yeah, all of that.
Did you ever see Mr. Capone on the premises of the Ship?
Sure, he came around once in a while.
Now, was that as a customer or as something else?
When he came in, he always talked to the bosses, and he usually disappeared to the back room. I didn't ask any questions.
Mr. Reese, I show you a series of documents marked as Exhibits 2 through 23. This is a series of cashier's checks from the Pinkard State Bank made out to an individual named J.C. Dunbar. Can you identify these?
Yes, these are cashier's checks I received from the bank when I took the money over there.
Fine. And who is this J.C. Dunbar?
Do I have to answer that?
Well, for crying out loud, of course you do.
Well, okay. It was really me. I signed the name J.C. Dunbar to them. The bosses told me I had to do it or there would be trouble.
I understand. Now, Mr. Dunbar, Mr. Reese, if you look up at the screen behind the judge, please. I show you a check marked Exhibit number 22. Do you recognize it?
I do. This is a check for $5,000 signed on the back by J.C. Dunbar, just like the other ones, but this one also has another signature.
Please read the other name on the back.
It says Alphonse Capone. Geez, I'm not sure how that happened.
Do you believe that this is indeed an endorsement of this check by the defendant?
I'm afraid I have to say that it does look like his writing.
Thank you, Mr. Reese. So moving on, during your time at the Ship, did you ever have any occasion to observe any personnel changes that took place on June 2nd, 1927?
Yeah, the defendant and his brother Ralph came in and ordered a bunch of us to meet him in the back room. Then Al Capone says to Jimmy Mon and another employee something like, "I know damn well you're not playing straight with me." And he and Ralphie push him right out the back door into the alley. That's the last I saw of them.
No further questions.
Mr. Fink, do you wish to cross-examine the witness?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you. Absolutely. Mr. Rees, this is not your first time in a court of law, is it?
No, sir. I've been here before. I know where you're going with this.
Yes. Yes, I'm sure you know where I'm going with this. You're probably reminiscing about occupying that seat yourself next to Mr. Capone for, let's say, burglary, illegal sale of intoxicating beverages. Oh, here's an interesting one. Perjury. Perjury. Mr. Rees, it appears you have some trouble when it comes to telling the truth.
Look, a lot of that was just fluffed up stuff because the coppers don't like me. Never have. That's because when they come around asking for a little, shall we say, generosity from time to time, I tell them to go to hell.
I see. And did the prosecution tell you that if you didn't sing like a canary, they'll come down hard on you for criminal conspiracy?
Well, that's not the words they used, but they did let me know that it might show some leniency if I shared what I knew. At first, I told them I wasn't a rat, but I finally came around.
Was that after they tossed you into a cold, dark cell that you had time to think about it for a while?
Yes, more or less. I couldn't see another way around it.
Your Honor, this witness has clearly been intimidated, and I'm going to move that all of his testimony be stricken from the record.
Well, Mr. Fink, the witness's testimony speaks for itself. Members of the jury, it's up to you to decide each witness's credibility. Your motion is denied. Now, Counselor, if you wish to cross-examine him on his actual testimony rather than continuing to take us down another road, then go ahead.
No, Your Honor, I think I've made my point.
Jurors, you will disregard that remark and it will be stricken from the record. Now look, Mr. Fink, if you think that grandstanding and raising frivolous objections is the proper way to make your case in my courtroom, you have another thing coming. You're treading mighty close to a contempt order. Do I make myself clear?
Yes, Your Honor.
I love this. The witness may step down. Next.
Your Honor, at this time, the people call Mr. Elliot Ness.
Al, it's good to see you in this seat finally.
Raise your right hand. You promise to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you.
Your Honor, if I may have a moment to slightly shift my seat, I do not want to be seated with the defendant directly behind me. You can't talk like that.
Mr. Ness, what was your role in the investigation of Al Capone?
As Mr. Capone's outfit got more violent, people and businesses were staying away from Chicago, really hurting the city. The local police were mostly on the take and business was suffering. I was brought in as part of a team to start restoring order to Chicago.
Do you know why the federal government became involved in all this?
Yes, the truth is the police weren't doing their job. The revenue guys started digging through Capone's books for evidence of tax evasion. At the same time, I was directed to gather evidence of prohibition violations and to cripple Capone's ability to operate by cutting off a lot of his income.
How did you go about doing that?
Well, I selected a team of agents who could not be bought or bribed by Mr. Capone. I scoured the personnel files of prohibition agents around the country looking for men who were incorruptible and who also had a special set of skills.
Who did you find?
Well, the squad was mostly made up of about 10 agents. I selected the men based on their skills, their integrity, and the difficult and dangerous work we would be doing. Wiretapping, undercover work, and raids, just for starters.
When you say raids, I assume you are saying that you seized supplies of alcoholic beverages?
Objection, Your Honor. My client's not on trial for that. My client's on trial for tax evasion.
I will sustain that. Mr. Johnson, you know the rules.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. I was just trying to establish that Mr. Ness was a highly successful federal agent, an incorruptible public servant whose credibility is exceptionally high.
Mr. Johnson, we get that. I'm pretty sure the witness will have ample opportunity to tell the world about his heroic deeds later on. Maybe he can write a book about how untouchable he was. But today we're focusing only on tax evasion, so please proceed with that and do not stray from it again.
All right, Mr. Ness, did you have any occasion to obtain any financial records related to the defendant, Mr. Capone?
Yes, sir. On several of the raids, our team seized some ledgers, spreadsheets, and other business records that we turned over to the tax law team.
Did you compile any other records related to the activities of the defendant?
Yes, we did.
Could you elaborate?
Certainly. After obtaining the required approval to tap the telephone lines of Mr. Capone and his cronies at one of the defendant's hubs of operations...
Objection. Your Honor, there's no proof of that.
Sustained. Mr. Ness, please confine your answers to what you actually know.
Please continue, Mr. Ness.
As a result of the tapping of certain telephone lines at the Monte Carlo Cafe, we were able to obtain some information.
Could you describe how you knew you were tapping into the right phone line?
Well, it's quite ingenious. One of our agents used metal spikes to climb up a pole to the call box, and another agent worked his way into the inner circle there. So, he asked to use Ralph Capone's office phone to call his wife. Then our fellow on the pole listened to each line until he recognized our guy's voice on the other end. He installed the tap, and we were all set.
I'd like to show you a document marked Prosecution Exhibit Number 24. It's up on the screen. Can you identify it?
Certainly. That is a series of transcripts that my men prepared from the wiretap conversations.
And can you read the sections marked paragraphs 13 through 27?
Yes. So the individuals mentioned here are part of the Capone outfit. The individual named Whitey states, "How do we carve up this loot? Big Al is getting a little ornery. The numbers are down and a couple of the cops are clamoring for their share." This is followed by another Capone crony named Jackie, who states, "Look, this do-gooder guy, what's his name, Ness, in reference to me, he's becoming a problem. We're down about 5,000 a week now with the brewery shutdowns. We need to fire him back up." Whitey responds, "Well, we ought to do is take this guy out. For now, let's give Big Al the 10,000 off the top and hold off the other guys. If Al doesn't get his cut, we'll both be looking for work or pushing up daisies. And remember, cash only, no names, no net records. We've already had one slip-up where Al signed his own name on one of those Dunbar checks. Geez, guys, you got to be more careful."
Thank you, Mr. Ness. Now, could you explain how you would interpret those sections you just read?
Objection, Your Honor. Once again, that's speculation. That's up for the jury to decide, not Mr. Ness.
Mr. Fink, I have to believe that Mr. Ness, as a seasoned investigator, would have a perspective on this that is different than the man in the streets. So your objection is overruled. Sir, you can answer the question.
Okay. I've studied reams upon reams of wiretap transcripts. The pattern I've seen is one of collecting a large volume of cash, always in cash, so as to avoid any kind of paper trail and making sure that the defendant receives his cut above all else. That's the simple answer. I certainly could elaborate.
No, Mr. Ness, you will not. We will allow that testimony to stand as presented, but we will not progress down the slippery slope of speculation beyond that. Now, let's move on.
Very well, Your Honor. Mr. Ness, everyone has read about your heroic raids in the newspaper. Just how did your squad get the name The Untouchables?
I'm sorry, Your Honor, but I've got to object again. Does it really matter what the headlines of a newspaper read?
Your Honor, I believe I do have a right to establish the credibility of my witness.
I'll overrule the objection, but let's keep it brief. The witness may answer the question.
Well, there was a reason I pulled in the newspapers to help us. The blood and the violence in the city had gotten way out of hand, and many of those in law enforcement were corrupt. The public was losing faith in our institutions, and we wanted to send the message loud and clear that these criminals won't triumph over law and order. So one of the papers dubbed us as untouchable, and I guess it kind of stuck.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Fink, would you like to cross-examine?
Absolutely. Mr. Ness, I believe you've testified that you were targeting certain individuals, and I quote, who were believed to be connected to the defendant. Just how did you determine something like that?
Well, early in this investigation, we developed organizational charts. It became soon evident that certain subjects of our investigation were taking their orders from Mr. Capone and his associates.
Evident to you, perhaps. Your transcripts referred to a person you called Big Al. Do you know how many people, how many men in Chicago are named Big Al?
Not really.
Okay, neither do I. But it probably numbers in the hundreds, don't you think, or more? And would you agree that more than one of them might be a little overweight, or tall, or maybe a pretty important guy? Ergo, Big Al?
That's probably a safe guess.
Right. So in other words, when these guys were talking about a person known as Big Al, you've got no real proof who they were talking about. You're just what they call a professional speculator. That you were talking about, they were talking about my client.
Sir, that is for others here to decide. But I can tell you that there was only one individual named Al who we were actively investigating. And that individual is a rather large man in both ego and stature.
All right, Your Honor, we have
Mr. Ness, you may step down.
Your Honor, the government has just one more witness. The people call Mr. Joseph Rosenblum.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Is it true that you operated a men's clothier and jewelry store on Michigan Avenue in Chicago?
I'm proud to say that this business has been in our family for more than 40 years, through the good times and the bad.
Well, congratulations. Now, your business probably attracts a certain class of customers who are able to afford the quality merchandise that you offer. Was the defendant, Mr. Capone, one of your customers?
Yes, Mr. Capone was what I would call a regular. It was my honor to serve him personally.
What type of merchandise did he buy?
Mr. Capone had impeccable taste and very high standards. Silk shirts, diamond-studded belt buckles and cufflinks, and those kinds of things. He wanted the best we had.
And how did he pay?
We had an arrangement. I kept a tab, and at the end of every month, I'd send him a bill. Within a few days, one of his guys would come around and pay it in cash. Never failed.
So, I show you what's marked as prosecution exhibit number 25. It is your log of the invoices paid to your business by Mr. Capone. The bottom line from 1927 appears to show that the defendant made payments of just under $19,000. And in 1928, he paid you a total of $15,000 and change. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. My records are a source of personal pride.
I have nothing else. Your witness.
no questions, Your Honor.
You may step down.
Your Honor, at this time, the people rest.
Very well. In the interest of time, unless anyone needs a break, Mr. Fink, you may call your first witness.
The defense calls Mr. Patrick Romano.
Please raise your right hand. You promise to swear that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Romano, where are you employed, and in what capacity are you employed?
My official title is Assistant Manager at the Hawthorne Hotel.
And what type of business is that?
It's a place for people to rent a room, buy some fine cigars, and hang around to relax and talk with their friends, you know?
So, what do you do? What exactly is the job? Does the job as assistant manager entail?
I do a lot of stuff, really. I'm sort of a security guard, kind of doorman, making sure there's no trouble. I try to be a host, Really, anything that needs to be done to assistantly manage the place.
And how do you draw your pay?
Well, every Friday, Mr. Reese or Mr. Kuzik pays me in cash. I get a base of about $60 a week, sometimes a little more thrown on top. If we had a good day, they take care of me.
While you've been employed at the Hawthorne, have you ever had occasion to speak with my client?
Yeah, once in a while. I mean, he used to come in from time to time. He pretty much talked to everybody. So sometimes we talked.
Did he discuss any business matters with you?
Nah, he was more interested in horse racing and basically small talk. He liked to shoot the breeze about politics and baseball.
Did anyone who was employed at the Hawthorne consider him to be the boss, the owner, or someone special?
That's a tricky question you got there, Counselor. The boss, the owner, no. Someone special? Well, hell yes, he's Al Capone. Everybody knows who he is.
All right, so when it came to business dealings, you as an assistant manager never had any reason to believe that my client was involved in owning or running the business. Is that correct?
If he was, I never saw it.
Did he ever deliver your pay?
Hell no. I told you, I got that from Fred Reese or Greasy Thumb Kuzik.
So as an assistant manager, one would assume that you would know whether a person was or was not the owner, correct? I have no further questions. You're a witness.
Mr. Romano, you seem to have a pretty nice job there. You said that when you assistantly manage the Hawthorne, your basic job is to talk to people?
No, not exactly. I mean, if anybody gets out of line, I have my way of, say, persuading them that they might want to move along. If I got to rough up a guy, that's what I do.
So you're what they refer to in the newspaper as the muscle. And you also mentioned that you get paid in cash and you sometimes get a bonus if the Hawthorne had a good week. You didn't mean to say that there were any illegal activities, for instance, gambling going on there, did you?
Now, wait a minute. Judge, this guy trying to trick me or something? I never said there was gambling there.
Well, was there?
I think everybody likes a little action from time to time, if that's what you mean. So like just about every other joint, the boys might have flipped a few cards and thrown the bones, or wagered a buck or two on the ponies.
Your Honor, I move that this portion of the testimony be stricken from the record. Mr. Romano is my witness, and he was called to verify that my client was not a boss or the owner of the Hawthorne. That's all we're doing here today.
Sustained. Jurors,
Thank
you
you.
are to disregard all references about gambling. Mr. Johnson, do you have anything that actually relates to the direct testimony?
Just one more, Your Honor. Mr. Romano, getting back to your weekly pay, do you have any idea why you were paid in cash rather than by check?
Look, buddy, I did my work, I got my pay. Why would I ask any questions? I told you before, they took care of me.
No further questions.
Mr. Romano, you may step down. Mr. Fink, please call your next witness.
Thank you, Your Honor. The defense calls Mr. Milton Head. Hell.
Please raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Hell, I know this has been awkward for you. I say that because, let's face it, your occupation is that of a hookie. Is that not correct?
You betcha. That's what I do. Hey, I'm not going to get in any hot water, am I?
No, you'll be okay. In the course of conducting your business, let me ask you this. Did you have occasion to become acquainted with my client, Mr. Capone?
I sure did. Probably 4 or 5 times a week.
And what type of wagering did Mr. Capone enjoy?
Oh, that's an easy one. Horses. He loved to bet the ponies.
I see. And was he skilled at this hobby?
Oh, geez. I don't want to get him too riled up or nothing. But I have to say that he was pretty lousy at it. No offense, sir. He really liked the long shots. Every once in a while, one of them would come in and he was on top of the world. But there were plenty of other times when he bet on a dog, and I told him so.
Do you have any idea how much he would lose, let's say, on a weekly basis?
Wow, well, it was a lot of loot. There'd be days when he'd lose a couple $1,000. Most day it was probably $400 or $500. I'll tell you this, none of my clients had as much bad luck, if you want to call it that.
So let me ask you one last question. How many days do you suppose you delivered those services for Mr. Capone?
Oh, let's see. If you go back over 2 years, it'd probably be a couple hundred.
So just for rough calculations, let's say we had an average day at the races would cost my client $500. And you totaled that totaled 200 days over the tax years in question. I can do that in my head. That's $10,000. Does that sound right to you?
Hey, man, I ain't no math genius. I just know he lost a lot of loot.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any cross?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Held, you have thrown out a lot of numbers here, and you make it appear that the defendant was the unluckiest man who ever lived. In your professional experience, have you ever serviced any other client who was so utterly inept at this pastime?
Well, I've seen guys we call born losers, but never a fellow who lost as much as Mr. Capone. Not that I'm calling you a loser, sir.
And would you have any documentation? Did you keep a daily log or any betting slips that might help us verify anything you've said?
Buddy, in my racket, we don't keep no paperwork. I think you can figure out why that is.
I see. No further questions.
You may step down.
Your Honor, we have just one more witness. The defense calls Mr. Oscar Gutter.
You swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Gutter, I assume you heard the testimony of Mr. Held regarding my client's affinity for horse racing and his rather limited success in doing so.
Sure, I heard him.
So you probably know where I'm going with this.
I'll make it easy for you. Yeah, I'm a bookie, and yeah, I ran a lot of wagers for Mr. Capone and his associates. What's the big deal? Hey, they're good tippers.
All right. We'll get to that. But slow down. Do you have an estimate of how much money my client paid to you to lay down his bets on horse racing in 1927 and 28?
Geez, I don't know. I mean, it was a lot. A couple $100 a week, easy.
Your Honor, I'm going to object. The witness said, and I quote, "I don't know."
I'll overrule that. He can give his estimates.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Gutter, were you also responsible for delivering to the defendant the winnings from his wagers?
Yes, of course. I mean, I'm a square dealer.
And did you observe any patterns as to the outcomes in this rather expensive hobby he enjoyed?
Let me put it this way. He spent a hell of a lot of more than what he made, just like Milty just told you. He didn't have much luck. But it's not like he didn't have the money to lose. I mean, a couple $100 to a guy like Al Capone.
Listen, Mr. Gutter, that's certainly enough. No further questions. Your witness, Mr. Johnson.
So, the jury just heard you testify that you were, and I quote, responsible for delivering the winnings to the defendant. Doesn't that suggest that there were times when he actually did quite well at the track? I mean, we heard Mr. Held testify that Mr. Capone liked to bet on the long shots. They must pay off pretty handsomely.
I don't know what you're trying to get me to say here. Mac, I ain't got no reason to keep count.
Exactly. Thank you. Nothing further, Your Honor.
Mr. Gutter, you're excused. So, gentlemen, assuming there are no more witnesses or exhibits to present, are we prepared to move on to closing arguments?
People are ready, Your Honor.
If I could just confer with my client, Your Honor, for a moment. Yes, Your Honor, the defense is ready to proceed.
Gentlemen, any number of good citizens in this great land go about their daily lives barely scratching out a living, keeping the wolf from their door. But even those with the least ability to pay recognize the importance of meeting their patriotic duty to pay their taxes. They may not like it that much. I mean, who really enjoys paying taxes? What you have heard today is that this defendant lived like a king. He spent thousands of dollars without thinking twice. Even a child could deduce from Mr. Capone's lavish lifestyle that he had a huge income. Did this defendant, about whom the defense has woven a halo of virtue, really find the pot at the end of the rainbow? Is he really Robin Hood? Did he buy those diamond belt buckles to give to the unemployed? Did he purchase those expensive silk shirts to protect the shivering men who slept under the Wacker Drive Bridge at night? Now let's talk about that settlement agreement that the defendant was so anxious to sign. That's because he knew he was guilty. What choice did he really have? Perhaps if he would have come clean with how much income he was really taking in and paid his taxes, he wouldn't be here today. I regret that the defense's cupboard was so barren that the only argument when it came to their client's tax-free income was that he had a spotty record when it came to wagering at the local horse tracks. And that came from a couple of guys you probably wouldn't want your daughter bringing home for dinner. And notice how there were no numbers attached to any of the testimony. Just pure speculation. Clearly, that was the only horse they could ride in this trial, and it never even got out of the gate. In the final analysis, as the evidence has clearly shown, this defendant is a tax cheat, and that's all there is to it. But I'm not quite finished. If the people only paid their taxes when they felt like it, our country would collapse, our military would disband, our institutions would vanish, and our civilization would fail. Today, gentlemen, your verdict would make a statement that would echo around the world, that no one, absolutely no one, is above the law.
Mr. Fink, you may proceed.
That was unrehearsed. Gentlemen of the jury, you are the only check on the oppressive government that's intent on twisting and abusing our country's tax laws to get my client out of its hair. As I told you at the start, they clearly don't like him, and I still think they're jealous of him. Oh, they'll talk a good game about tax evasion today, but you and I both know that what they were really doing was trying to make you believe that he's a bad man. Well, hell, he may be the worst man ever. But this trial's about taxes, not anything else. What they're saying he's actually guilty of is being successful in the business world. Now, maybe I'm old-fashioned, but no, to my way of thinking, that's something I admire if you're successful in business. And unlike a lot of successful businessmen, my client welcomed the opportunity to share what he earned by volunteering to pay taxes as they introduced in their opening statement. As you deliberate, please, please pay special attention to prosecution exhibit number 1, wherein Mr. Capone was eager, yes, eager to pay taxes. $15,000 in today's world. That's a lot of money for just 2 years of income. Does that sound like tax evasion to you? There's not one shred of evidence that the defendant willfully attempted to defraud the government. Now, let me tell you a little bit about who my client really is. I could have called dozens of witnesses to testify how Mr. Capone is, and the truth about this man and his open-handed generosity, and the kind of man who never fails a friend. It would be crystal clear to you that my client is anything but a piker and that would try to cheat the government out of anything. He doesn't have to cheat anybody out of anything. And lastly, as Mr. Held and Mr. Gutter both testified, my client clearly lost a fortune in horse races. So while his personal income has never been documented, not even a little, but only hinted about, you clearly heard where a lot of it ended up, on the ponies. So in the end, if you deduct what he lost and what he gave in charitable giving and expenses of business and that embarrassing gambling losses, how much money did he really make that he'd have to pay taxes on? You gentlemen are the last barrier between this defendant and the encroachment and perversion of the government and the law. I believe your duty is clear. Thank you.
At this point, Judge Wilkerson spent more than an hour delivering his highly technical charge to a very weary jury. The 12 jurors then left the courtroom to begin their deliberations. They filed back in some 8 hours later, looking exhausted and sullen-faced with their verdict in hand. Reporters packed the gallery like a tin of sardines. Hundreds of people gathered outside the federal court building in anticipation. It was now time for Al Capone to learn his fate, and the whole world was watching.
Would the defendant please rise and come forward with defense counsel? Gentlemen of the jury, have you arrived at a verdict?
We have.
We, the jury, find, oh, yeah, there we go. We, the jury, find the defendant not guilty as charged in indictment number 1, criminal conspiracy to evade taxes. And we find the defendant guilty on counts 1 and 5, evasion of taxes and failure to file an income tax return.
Not a crime to be a sharp dresser.
Order in this court at once. Sentencing is deferred so that the court can review the trial record and the requisite legal matters. Members of the jury, you are excused. All others must remain in the courtroom until such time as I dismiss you.
The conviction was an overwhelming victory for the government. Al Capone was going to prison. The only question, for how long? 6 days later, Judge Wilkerson reconvened the court to hand down his sentence.
Alphonse Capone, it is the judgment of this court that you shall pay fines aggregating $50,000. In addition, you shall be sentenced to the penitentiary for a period of 11 years.
Your Honor, we would immediately request that the defendant be released on bail.
Denied, denied. The defendant is remanded to the custody of the United States Marshal. I'm told there is a secure transport vehicle positioned at the front entrance. Guards, would you please escort the defendant from the courthouse? This court is adjourned.
publicity, too much hollering about Capone in the papers. It was a blow below the belt. But what can you expect when the whole community is prejudiced against you? There's a lot of big men in Chicago who beat the government out of taxes. Don't kid yourselves, and they got away with it. So they've got me for now, and I'll have to take my medicine until we get this thing turned around.
After his conviction in October of 1931, Al Capone was detained in the county jail in Cook County. He appealed the verdict all the way up to the United States Supreme Court, which took until May of 1932, 90 years ago next month, to deny his final appeal. And there's an interesting story about what happened after that. On May 3rd, 1932, Capone was escorted from the county jail to the Dearborn train station on Dearborn Street in Chicago. He was surrounded by federal agents. Eliot Ness was there. In years later, critics of Eliot Ness would claim that he never came face to face with Al Capone. And you may remember there's a famous scene in the Kevin Costner movie that came out in 1987 where Kevin Costner as Eliot Ness walks into the Lexington Hotel and stares down Al Capone, played by Robert De Niro. So this is the real picture of Capone being led off to the train station that would take him to prison. He requested that his handcuffed wrists be allowed to be put in his pockets and behind his back because he didn't want to be photographed in handcuffs. And the guy just over Capone's left shoulder is another criminal that was being transported, and he's actually chained to Al Capone's hands behind his back. And he's surrounded here by federal agents. And as to the claim that Capone and Ness never came face to face, we now know that that's not true, because if you look to the far left of the photograph, staring right at Al Capone as he's led off to prison, is none other than Eliot Ness. After leaving Chicago, Eliot Ness became the director of public safety in Cleveland, which is kind of like the police commissioner and the fire commissioner combined. He was very successful in that job, and he was a very popular public figure. Unfortunately, after that, he decided that he was so popular that he would try his hand at politics. He ran for mayor and lost very handily. He was even less successful in the private sector as a businessman, and he moved to Coudersport, Pennsylvania, not very far from here, where he spent his final days, and he died way too early, at age 54 in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. Right before he died, he and a sports writer named Oscar Fraley got together in the Hotel Crittenden, which is still standing in Coudersport, and they gathered up Eliot's scrapbooks and memories, and Oscar Fraley put together the book that would make the legend of Eliot Ness, that was called The Untouchables. Eliot Ness never lived to see the publication of the book. He did not live to see any of the profits that the book generated. Of course, after that, the TV series starring Robert Stack in the 1950s popularized the image of the Untouchables, and then again in 1987, the Kevin Costner movie reinstated Ness's fame with the general public. Since 2018, Coudersport, Pennsylvania has held an Eliot Ness Festival in Coudersport. It was postponed because of COVID for 2 years. It's coming back this year, July 15th through 17th, 2022 in Coudersport, Pennsylvania. Obviously, everybody is welcome to be there. And this picture is some of the actors from the Capone trial that we did in the courthouse in Coudersport, as well as a number of the direct descendants of the actual agents who were the Untouchables. Thank you all for coming, and especially thank you to our participants for having some fun with us today.